Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to be chatting with you about my subject, the history of fashion. My name's Amanda Hallay, and I create and teach fashion history courses and courses on cultural history and the history of popular culture for LIM College in Manhattan and other places. I'm also a consultant for the movie and gaming industries, which is great fun and certainly keeps me young. And I run a not unpopular YouTube channel called The Ultimate Fashion History, where I talk about my passion for all things fashion history. I'm calling this lecture Who Wore What When, and why the Raiders of the Lost Ark font, do you think? Well, that's because I like to think of myself as the Indiana Jones of fashion history, but I think I'm just flattering myself here because, in all honesty, I'm really like a spinster sleuth in an Agatha Christie novel, diligently piecing together all of these little clues that we find in the past to explain why people wore what they wore, why they dressed the way that they did. One of my favorite catchphrases, and my students hear this a million times a day, is this: fashion is not an island, it's a response. I've said it so often that somebody turned it into one of these little internet meme quotes. Fashion is not an island. It never is, and it never was. It is a response to the world that wears it. I'll explain. But first, in terms of academe, fashion, it doesn't always have the best reputation. In fact, I think it might be the other F word. When people hear the word fashion or fashion history as an academic discipline, they tend to think of three things. One, that it is a study of the way that clothing in the past was constructed, how it was cut, how it was tailored, how it was all sewn together. And they think, yeah, this is great, but this is only useful to costume designers. And it certainly is useful to costume designers. I mean, if it wasn't for people who make a study of the tailoring and production of historic clothing, then everybody in Outlander would be wearing jeans and t-shirts, probably. We need to know this. Costume designers need to know this. But you know what? I don't really know this. This isn't the area of fashion history that I study. Alternatively, there's an idea that fashion history or costume history is all about the care and preservation of historic textiles. And that includes learning where dyes came from in the Middle Ages, weaving techniques, the preservation of these wonderful fragments that we have of textiles from even the Neolithic era. And I'm so glad that there are people who devote their lives to doing this. This is important work. But again, that's not really the part of fashion history that I focus on. At the very worst, there's a belief that those of us who study fashion history do so because we just want to look at pretty dresses. Looking at pretty dresses is an occupational hazard of being a fashion historian. It's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it. We have to look at pretty dresses, but you know what? That's not why we do it. Let me put it another way. We study art history, don't we? We study art history and use it as an optic through which to understand the people of the past, their emotions, their concerns, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their aesthetic. We also use the history of music to study the emotional landscape of the past. And of course, we study literature, don't we? We use all of these things as optics through which to study the past, as well as economic history, political history, geology, even if we're looking at the distant past. And yet fashion history isn't taken quite as seriously as an optic through which to examine the past. And I am here today to tell you that it should be, because you know what? In the Italian Renaissance, less than 1% of the population ever saw a beautiful, beautiful fresco by Leonardo da Vinci. And yet, every single person wore clothes. So why don't we look at clothing with the same interest? Why don't we look at fashion with the same passion that we look at fashion history or political history? I think we should. I mean, for example, take a look at this shoe. Now, a lot of people would look at this and think, yes, that's a pretty shoe, and it looks quite old. Well, it is an old shoe, and it is quite pretty. It comes from the 18th century, but when fashion historians look at this shoe, they don't just see a pretty shoe. We see, of course, the whole Rococo art movement, but more than that, we see the Huguenot massacres, which of course leads us to the Spitalfield silk weavers and the refugee experience, one that was experienced in the 18th century and continues to be experienced today by refugees all around the world. Of course, we see Diderot, we see the birth of the encyclopedia, the 18th century obsession with categorizing plants and flowers and animals. We also see more sinister things. We see European expansionism. We see slavery in this shoe. We see the subjugation of people around the world by a European masterclass. And we also smell the blood of the coming revolutions in this shoe. So fashion is not this frou-frou thing that, well, let's just look at what people in the past wore. Let's look at all these pretty dresses. It doesn't really matter. It does matter. Clothing is an optic through which to really understand the past. And it's so exciting, believe me, because it's part of the jigsaw puzzle that makes up any given historic period. It makes up the zeitgeist, along with politics, economics, the weather, architecture, art, literature, technology, everything, and fashion fits right in. Without clothing, that jigsaw puzzle doesn't tell you the whole story. For example, imagine a new tomb is discovered in Egypt, in the Valley of the Kings. So exciting. Imagine a new tomb with new artifacts. And in this tomb, on the figures that we see in the tomb paintings or on the sarcophagi, the characters are not dressed like this, but like this. This would change absolutely everything that we have come to know about ancient Egypt. It would rock our worlds. It would change everything we thought we knew about the way ancient Egyptians lived, about trade, travel, technology. It would change everything. And I use that as an example of why fashion is important, because if we discovered a tomb in ancient Egypt where people dressed like this, it would change everything. So clothing is important. It tells as much of the story of the past as anything else, as much as architecture or art or literature or music. Not everybody read, but everybody wore clothes. Okay, the who wore what when. Well, that's kind of easy to figure out. Why? Well, because we have sculptures, we have paintings, we have drawings, we have written accounts. Sometimes we're very fortunate and have extant pieces of clothing that have survived over the centuries and even over the millennia. And from the 19th century onwards, we have photographs. So the who wore what when bit of fashion history is easy. It's the why that, it's what I live for. That's what makes it really exciting, and why fashion historians have to use so many theories. We have more theories than astrophysicists. We rely on theories, but they don't come from nowhere because we go back to that jigsaw puzzle and we look at everything else that's happening at any given moment in history to try to figure out why people wore what they did, why they were drawn to the clothes that they wore. Let's go back to ancient Egypt for a second. Look at this image here from the Old Kingdom, this from the Middle Kingdom, and this from the New Kingdom. There are slight differences, but considering 3,000 or so years separate these images, fashion didn't change very much, did it? It was all based on rather diaphanous clothing, a lot of skin showing, not much tailoring. And fashion didn't change because it didn't have to change. Fashion changes when it needs to, when it wants to. And for thousands of years in ancient Egypt, fashion really didn't change that much. Look, they're all wearing essentially the same wig. The aesthetic didn't change. And then suddenly, take a look at this. Look at what she's wearing. She is wearing a tailored tunic dress with an embroidered print. What happened to make fashion change so suddenly after not changing for thousands of years? Well, we'll take this image on the right and put it back in its context, which is here. This is a tomb painting, and look at the guy in the center. He's dressed as a Roman. What happened to make fashion change? Well, in, what was it, 30 BC? The Romans occupied Egypt and fashion changed. Egyptians started dressing in the mode of the Romans. And so I use this as an example to show you that sometimes we know why fashion changes. But if we didn't know that the Romans had invaded Egypt, we would be left quite confused. But this isn't confusing for fashion historians because we just go back to the history books to figure out what happened to make fashion change so drastically. But that's a drastic change. Sometimes something can happen that will spark a fashion trend. And we'll stick to Egypt for this one, but jump ahead a couple thousand years to the 1920s, to the Jazz Age, when suddenly there was a craze in fashion for anything and everything Egyptian, like this beautiful gown here. And look at the embroidery on this jacket pulled from a tomb painting or a sarcophagus. Look at this beautiful Art Deco brooch. Now, of course, the ancient Egyptian aesthetic lent itself very well to Art Deco, but this is really on the nose. This screams ancient Egypt. The bobbed hairdos with the bangs of the 1920s that the trendiest girls wore, this was inspired by ancient Egypt, as was eye makeup. But fashion was just responding to everything else that was responding to ancient Egypt. Architecture, I am in love with this movie house from the 1920s with its pseudo-Egyptian style. Homeware was inspired by ancient Egypt. Entertainment, look at this. Advertising. This is delightful Palmolive reincarnation of beauty with a sarcophagus there in this wonderful looking early 1920s woman. Music. What is this? Egyptia, the foxtrot. There were tons of popular songs about ancient Egypt. I think one was called Old King Tut was a wise old nut, which is wrong on every count because Tutankhamun was not old. He died when he was, 17? But nobody cared about the historic truth in this craze, this Egyptomania, as it was known. And it all happened when Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 in a world recovering from the trauma of World War I. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb just grabbed the imagination internationally. People loved this story. First of all, the tomb was full of gold and riches beyond one's wildest dreams. Absolutely spectacular stuff. And this was headline news around the world. New tomb found, Egypt's greatest. It didn't hurt that Howard Carter was this very handsome and dashing and dapper Englishman who, against all odds, kept his dream alive, kept looking for that tomb and eventually found it. People loved this. This was a feel-good story. And then, of course, the whole mystery of the curse of Tutankhamun's tomb. Of course, it was complete hogwash, but this gripped everyone's imagination. Egyptomania was everywhere. And of course, fashion is not an island, it's a response. And fashion was going to respond, and respond it did. Look at this wonderful shift dress here. Could it be more inspired by ancient Egypt? So this was an example of a fad, of a trend, of a craze that fashion adopted, but based on something else, all part of the jigsaw puzzle. Let's look at another era of fashion history so I can talk to you a bit about theories. Theories we come up with to explain why people dressed the way that they did and why they were drawn to the silhouette, to the palette, to the details that they were. So let's look at, yes, a century with a lot of pretty dresses, the 18th century. Now, in these beautiful Rococo paintings, this clothing looks beautiful. It's exquisite. Look at the color, look at the detail, look at the embroidery. Yes, it is gorgeous to look at in a painting. But let's look a little deeper. Take a look at these silhouettes. Silhouette is so important when telling the story of clothing and why people wore what they did. Still here, it looks quite pretty. Not too weird, but just brace yourselves. Add to it these weird white faces painted with ceruse, this horrible lead-based white powder, the powdered wigs, the little beauty spots, and suddenly things start to become rather weird. Look at this. Look at this silhouette. Look at the shape of these skirts. Imagine the aliens, if you believe in such things, arrived in the 18th century and they saw this dress. They would be forgiven for thinking that this was the shape of a human body. It bears no correlation to the shape of a woman's body, does it? These huge hips created with panniers, a sort of undergarment, very stiff, that made the hips so enormously wide. Now, you have probably heard, I have heard, and it drives me crazy. Whenever there's something very strange going on in female silhouettes in fashion history, people say it's so the aristocracy could prove that they had childbearing hips. You've heard that, right? The whole childbearing hips thing. I don't actually buy this. I don't buy this for a number of reasons. First of all, let's just look at the aristocracy of the 17th century. They didn't do that with their hips, right? I don't believe it had anything to do with childbearing hips, just as I don't believe that the white ceruse makeup had anything to do with proving that you were so wealthy that you didn't have to work outside. Well, I think if you're wearing this jacket, people know you're not working outside in the fields, right? No, I think there are other reasons for this. And this is when we come to our theories, where we look at all of those pieces in the jigsaw puzzle and try to figure out why people wore what they did and why people in the 18th century, the wealthy, the aristocrats, the royals, wanted to look this way, wanted to present themselves in these colors, in these silhouettes, and with this much going on. The 18th century marks the pinnacle of the Enlightenment. the height of the age of reason. You know, in the 18th century, I once read that the highest compliment a man could pay to another man was to say that he was reasonable. This was what it was all about. This was man's triumph over nature, over everything that had come before. This was also the height of European expansion, wasn't it? This is when Europe basically subjugated much of the rest of the world. So, in the European mind, the only human being worth talking about was a European human being. So, Europe, a European man taking over the rest of the world, subjugating other men. This was European man's triumph over what they perceived as lesser men. I mean, look at this map. Europe had taken over so much of the world, and we see all of this in the clothing. But it was also man taming nature. This was the era of these incredible sculpted gardens, with gardeners like Capability Brown becoming the celebrities of their day. Nature was being tamed. Artificial lakes were made to create these man-made landscapes. This really was an idea that people had of man, white, Western, European cultures at their peak. They believed they were at their peak. So to put it into a phrase, this was a time of artifice. Artifice ruled. It was man's triumph over nature, or so he perceived. And in a way, man himself became man-made. There was nothing natural about the way that aristocratic people looked, and that included the shape of their own bodies. This is the shape of a human body, a female body. And look what fashion did to it in the 18th century. These stiff panniers extended the hips outward, almost like a woman was wearing a table. Over that went her gown to create this unusual shape. Add to that the big powdered wigs, and if you look at this in silhouette, it bears no relation to the silhouette of a normal human being, does it? It's extraordinary. The same goes with the makeup, the powdered faces, and the big wigs. They look very pretty in paintings, but in real life, they probably looked a bit more like this. It was all about artifice. People didn't want to look human. That's my theory anyway. It really was this moment, this very strange moment, where the wealthy, aristocratic, and quote unquote fashionable people of Europe believed that to show their triumph over both the past and nature and everybody else in the world who wasn't a white European, they created this artificial image of themselves. It's so bizarre, but so interesting. Anyway, that is a theory. There are others. I'd love to hear yours. And of course, fashion belongs in the jigsaw puzzle. So if an aristocratic European lived in a home that looked like this, they would have to dress accordingly. But of course, I am painting in very broad strokes here. Clothing always echoes the architecture, the domestic landscape, if you will, of any given era or any location. She looks a little bit overdressed for this interior, does she not? Because this is a colonial American interior. Things were simpler in colonial America, and fashion responded. You'll see this is a beautiful gown from 18th century colonial America, but it is a little simpler because life was a little different. And so I'm painting with broad strokes here. And yet you can see that both of these gowns come from the same era and from the same aesthetic background. But not this. This is from a couple decades later, 2 or 3 decades later. And wow, what a difference. What happened in the world from the mid to the late 18th century to make fashion so different at the beginning of the 19th century? Because that is a big, big difference. And of course, there's reasons why fashion changes. There are always reasons why fashion changes, especially when fashion changes so dramatically. And I think you probably all know what happened in between, right? I mean, just take a look at these two couples. They really seem to come from different millennia, let alone different decades. Not much time separated these two couples. And yet, this couple on the left, with his beautiful powdered pink velvet, his gold embroidery, her beautiful sumptuous satin, are very different to this far more sober couple on the right from the early 19th century. Her gown is so simple, his clothing is so somber, it's so sensible. Why did fashion change so radically? There are reasons. How about a couple of revolutions? The American Revolution, of course, the French Revolution. Art would change dramatically. Take a look at this. We all know this. The Swing by Fragonard. Could anything be more light and playful and sexy? This beautiful girl on a swing in her coral pink dress, a little shoe flying off, and her suitor lurking in the bushes, looking up her skirt. Oh, how the 18th century loved this kind of frivolity. And suddenly we move from that to the death of Socrates. Wow, there's a big change. There really was a change in the zeitgeist, moving from playful and sexy frivolity to earnest, somber, and serious stuff. And people like Rousseau. Now, Rousseau had been writing and philosophizing in the 18th century, and people thought it was interesting. But it was really in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, that Rousseau's ideas about getting back to nature, about abandoning artifice, about man finding his true natural self again, this is when it really took off. People were reading Rousseau. Yes, let's get back to nature. Let's take off all of this ceruse. Let's take off our wigs. Let's get back to who we really are. And who shall we use as our guide? The ancient Greeks. There was a fad, a mania, a craze for all things classical at the beginning of the 19th century. Take a look at this sculpture, this Hellenic sculpture, and then, come on, let's look at Regency and Empire fashion. You can really see they basically copied the ancient Greeks with a few tweaks. They add little sleeves and things. But the idea is the same, and it's kind of fun. So many gowns that exist from the Regency era, which I know we all love, are in white or in cream or in ivory. And this is because they were using marble statues as their inspiration and believed that because these marble statues are white, that everybody wore white in ancient Greece, which they didn't. And these statues, many were wildly painted. But of course, time robs history of color. And after centuries, all of the paint chipped off, and we were left with these beautiful white marble statues, which Regency fashion designers loved. And this explains fashion is not an island, it's a response, even when that response is a little bit erroneous. Even Regency hairdos borrowed from ancient Greece. Take a look at this Grecian bust here, and then look at this Regency hairstyle. You can really see that the classical world, the Hellenic world, was a bit of a craze. It was a fad. People loved it. But that was women's wear. Men did not go back to ancient Greece for sartorial inspiration. Take a look at these full-length portraits of men in the 1810s, 1820s. Spot the difference? Guess what? You can't. All of these men are basically wearing the same outfit, aren't they? They have on their shirt and their jabot and their tailcoat and their high-waisted pants and their boots, all in very somber colors. And this idea would actually continue through the 19th century. Yes, the silhouette would change. Jackets would get longer, top hats would get taller, waistlines would change a little bit, but this idea stayed. And it continued to stay in the 20th century, this idea of men wearing somber suits. This is a complete departure from the frivolity of fashion that we saw in the 18th century. It is a departure from the idea that fashion was both a male and a female domain. From the beginning of the 19th century onwards, this marks the point where fashion really became a female domain and men wore clothes. Yes, there are moments, for example, the peacock revolution of the 1960s, where men embraced color and lace and all of that. But generally, this idea that men should dress soberly started in the 19th century and, alas, kind of still prevails today, doesn't it? So here we have the silhouette of the Regency era. And what happened between here and here, between the 1810s and the 1830s? Something changed enormously. Now, I'm not going to be disingenuous and say that this change happened overnight, because we can see the silhouette widening a little bit as we get into the end of the 1820s. But by the time we're in the 1830s, look at that. It's completely different. This is so wide and so ostentatious. How did we go from something so simple like this to something so bizarre like this? Take a look at how wide those shoulders are, how huge those gigot sleeves are. Look at that lace. And if in the Regency era less was more, that certainly wasn't true by the time we hit the 1830s going into the 1840s, where more was more on women's wear. And yet it's so easy to explain, because this really saw the genuine start, the rise, the first explosion of that industrial revolution, and a burgeoning nouveau riche. This was something kind of new in the world, where people could make big money. And hey, you can't show your nouveau riche burgeoning factory wealth in a beautiful, simple Empire style gown like you see here on the left. No, people were living large, and so the silhouette became large. The more stuff you put on your dress or your bonnet, the wealthier your husband was, because a lot of this sort of ornamentation also fed into this idea that a woman became the property of her husband. This was real Victorian thinking at its height. And yet men continued to dress very, very soberly, because they were men of business now. They're not going to wear powder blue or baby pink velvet jackets with golden embroidery. No, they were going to work in the factories. They were going to run their factories or their railroads or whatever they did, or their mills. But men were serious and sober, and women's fashion got more and more embellished and outrageous. But let's just look at one item from the 19th century that I think is so cool to discuss: the top hat, a top hat that would grow taller and taller as the Industrial Revolution progressed. And very few people have offered up theories as to why the topper, as it was known, became so popular, why every man basically wore one. Well, I have a theory. Tell me if you buy it or if you think it's too far-fetched. But these top hats, what do they look like to you? What do they resemble? Well, to my eye, they look like factory chimneys, don't they? They also look like those big funnels on the new steamships. They look like the chimneys on railways, on trains, on the new steam train. All of this new technology that was driving society and the economy of the 19th century. And I think that top hats look like chimneys. I do. What do you think? So let's look at another period of history, the 1920s. Now, we all know, don't we, why 1920s fashion happened the way that it did. Suddenly, fashion changed, and we get this look, which it drives me crazy when people call it the flapper look, because flappers didn't dress this way. There's this idea that anyone who wore a shorter skirt in the 1920s was a flapper. Flappers are something else. That's a different story. This was basically the 1920s silhouette. Suddenly, for the first time in history, women were showing their legs, bare arms, drop waistlines, little cloche hats. Fashion changed very quickly after World War I, and we know why. Women went into the workplace in quite a big number, not the same number that we'd see in World War II, but so many young men died as a result of World War I that women were afforded opportunities that they hadn't been afforded prior to the war. Also, people were embracing the century anew. We'd had World War I, and of course, the so-called Spanish flu, that pandemic, which we've been talking about a lot recently, haven't we, in terms of our own pandemic that we're hopefully just crawling our way out of now. So there was this sense of drawing a line under the 20th century so far and starting the 20th century anew as a truly modern century, and fashion would respond to that. And most of all, suffrage wins. Women were emancipated and won the vote. And so all of these things sort of conspired to make 1920s fashion happen the way that it did. It was young, it was fresh, it was free, it was boyish, it was liberating. Gone were the corsets, women were living. And if you look at fashion in the 1910s, you can really see this change in silhouette, in fashion, in the whole aesthetic, the whole approach didn't happen by accident. There had to be a lot of powerful factors. And as you just saw, there were to make fashion change so radically. I mean, look at these ladies here. For these ladies to dress the way they are dressing here would have been unthinkable at the turn of the century. But this was the modern world. And then, whoops, what happened? Look at the 1930s. It's almost gone back a decade from the 20s, hasn't it? With that very low hemline, the fitted waist, everything very dainty, very feminine, very put together. What happened in the world to make fashion retreat? Well, I think you probably all know what happened. The Wall Street crash, and the world was plunged into the Great Depression. Another trauma so soon after all of the traumas that we saw in the 1910s. We had the 20s and then suddenly another trauma, and fashion, as it always does, responded. Suddenly we see this very dainty, very ladylike, very contrite, feminine way of dressing again. It was pretty, it was pulled together, it was very ladylike. And look at this evening gown by Adrian. It was a return to utter femininity. It was almost as if the world felt contrite. They were in the Great Depression, living through this really dreadful, scary time. And of course, in other parts of the world, we saw the rise of fascism as well. In the prairie states of America, the Dust Bowls, I mean, this really was sort of an Armageddon. It was a scary time, and fashion retreated. and it became very sweet, and it became very delicate, it became very safe. And I think it's very beautiful. I actually prefer it to 1920s fashion. And escapism was everything in the 1930s. Even for those who were wearing seed sack dresses, they looked to the silver screen for escapism, and fashion, Hollywood costume, would offer a lot of it, with these beautiful, slinky lame gowns that the world had never seen the likes of before, backless dresses so glamorous. And when you see them worn by actual women, actual movie stars, you can see this was over the rainbow stuff. This was pure escapism, because sometimes fashion doesn't reflect what's happening in the world. Sometimes it rejects reality and offers flights of absolute fancy. And this is certainly the case in Hollywood attire of the 1930s. The palette would also respond with gentle, soft hues of mauve and teal and every part of the lilac register. Really soft, gentle colors, not those bold tones we saw in the 20s. No, this was a return to softness and comfort in a time that was very scary. I love this palette. So soft, it's so pretty. And so there we have 1930s fashion as a reaction to what was happening in the world, and then bang, almost overnight, it would change again. Look at these two suits. You see the 1930s suit with its little shoulders and its long skirt. It's very feminine, it's very dainty, and then suddenly, wow, a much, much shorter hemline, big shoulders, very tailored, and that huge hat. And remember that beautiful evening gown we just saw, this meringue confection by Adrian for Joan Crawford? Here's Joan just a few years later, and look at the difference. Look at the difference in silhouette, in tailoring. Suddenly we go from this cotton candy confection of femininity to something so strong, so bold, so charged with energy. What had happened in the world to make fashion change so much, so quickly? Well, of course, you all know what happened. World War II happened, and fashion responded with broad shoulders that made women feel strong and empowered, because they had to feel strong, right? Utility clothing. It took away all of the fuss and dainty details of 1930s fashion, as did rationing. Rationing made trim, lace, stuff like that very hard to find or impossible to find. Hemlines, because of fabric rationing, would go up. They would raise to the knees. Clothing started to take on an aspect of uniforms. This is a civilian suit, but doesn't it look like a uniform of some sort? Colors became bold and strong. No more of those sweet, dusty tones that we saw in the 30s. Suddenly, we have bright, vibrant, saturated colors, often in very patriotic palettes, of course. Trim was very difficult to come by, so print took the place of trim to add interest to a garment with strong, big, bold prints, flowers, and palm trees. And cork wasn't rationed. Platform heels were made of cork, and because cork wasn't rationed, suddenly we get those huge 1940s platform heels. Accessories weren't rationed either. The idea being that let's not ration everything. Ladies were allowed accessories to boost morale, which is why hats in the 40s really became so whimsical and fun, really adding a dash of silliness in very scary, traumatic, and dramatic times. Gloves are accessories. They weren't rationed, and they got incredible. Look at these crazy striped gloves here. They're fabulous. And Of course, hair wasn't rationed, which explains why hairdos in the 1940s became so elaborate, so complicated, and so big, most notably with the famous victory rolls. So, of course, we all know that the big empowering shoulder pads and the victory rolls and the utility wear and the shorter hemlines were the big fashion story of World War II. But there were also fun little trends that popped up, like the one you're seeing here. There was a huge trend during the war years for anything Central American, South American, or Caribbean. Why? Well, fashion is not an island, it's a response. And this trend for everything south of the border was inspired by Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, his reduxed version of the Pan American Agreement that encouraged trade and travel with Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean nations. Now, of course, Roosevelt set this in play because he wanted to make sure that these nations were on the side of the Allies, which of course they ended up being, thank goodness. But also, he wanted to encourage trade and travel between North America, the United States, and South America. We couldn't go to Europe. Europe was at war. And of course, we were at war in the Pacific and in the East as well. And so the idea of South America, Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean was really sold on the American public. South of the border was the most sexy, glamorous place in the world. And this spawned a huge, huge fashion trend. There was an absolute craze for what is known as Mexican souvenir jackets, these wonderful felt jackets embroidered with Central American motifs. Look at this 1940s tie here with sombreros and a Mexican landscape. There was a craze for serape stripe, like you see here with this fun little play suit. And I love this, the Pan American brooch. Everybody went nuts for anything Latin American. It became a fashion trend, a real craze. But we see this interest in Latin America during World War II reflected in the movies of the era, like Saludos Amigos by the Walt Disney Animation Corporation, Down Argentine Way, Weekend in Havana, That Night in Rio. Stars like Carmen Miranda became huge, really riding that good neighbor policy vibe. And there were pop songs that also tied in with this craze. The coffee song. You know that song, Way Down Among Brazilians? Coffee beans grow by the billions, a big hit for Frank Sinatra. South America, Take It Away by Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters, Rum and Coca-Cola. When people write very seriously about the politics behind Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, they talk about the movies, they talk about the songs, but they never talk about the fashion, and they should, because it's one of the best optics through which to look at how the good neighbor policy of World War II was filtered through to the American public. So I really do think that fashion history is more interesting and more important than a lot of people might think. As the famous fashion editor and Costume Institute director Diana Vreeland famously said, "You can see and feel everything in clothes." So the next time you see a pair of those fabulous Louboutin shoes, what are you really seeing? You might just be smelling the blood of the coming revolution. Thanks very much for watching this little lecture.